come in. That's so cute. Okay, so we know we're living in the information age, and that information is part of a warfare. And I'd like to share a little bit about Facebook and fake news. Facebook is the largest social media service on the planet with over 2 billion users, which is over a quarter of the world's population. BuzzFeed News did an analysis of the 50 biggest fake news articles, and it shared 22 million times with reactions and comments. This was after spending 2 years launching a third-party fact-check program. So here we have some of the other fake news stories that were viewed over 150 million times on Facebook in 2019. And you can see the titles: Democrats vote to enhance Medicare for illegals now, vote down vets that have been waiting 10 years for the same service. Breaking, Nancy Pelosi's son was an exec at gas company that did business in Ukraine. Ilhan Omar holding secret fundraisers with Islamic groups tied to terror. Trump is now trying to get Mike Pence impeached. Nancy Pelosi is diverting Social Security money for the impeachment inquiry. These were just the 5 out of 100 different fake news stories that were shared on Facebook in 2019, and it's over 150 million times. So Facebook is still the home of viral fake news, and we must be cautious what we read and what we share. Please turn with me to Revelation 12:7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So we see what was the mode of warfare here, and was this a hot war? And as we know, it was not a hot war. It was an information war, a propaganda war, and a psychological war. So here we have the alpha of information war. And we know that the omega will be an information war. And that includes propaganda and psychological. So for the man from the beginning, we know where we're headed. We know where we are. 7MR, page 63.2. The influence of mind on mind, so strong a power for good when sanctified, is equally strong for evil in the hands of those opposed to God. This power Satan used in his work of instilling evil into the minds of the angels, and he made it appear that he was seeking the good of the universe. As the anointed cherub, Lucifer had been highly exalted. He was greatly loved by the heavenly beings, and his influence over them was strong. Many of them listened to his suggestions and believed his words. And then she continues with Revelation 7. Cast out of heaven, Satan set up his kingdom in this world, and ever since he has been untiringly striving to seduce human beings from their allegiance to God. He uses the same power that he used in heaven, the influence of mind on mind. So everything we know for our time, we find in the increase of knowledge. And if we're going to look at what mode of warfare that is on our line, we need to go back to the time of the end, which is 1989. 1989 was a big year. It was a milestone year. It was the major invention of the World Wide Web, and that was the biggest milestone in the information age. It actually brought it about. In Time magazine, they actually published a book in 2009 about the year 1989. And it was they did have an article, of course, about Tim Berners-Lee, who was working at CERN, which is Europe's particle physics lab in Geneva, and the internet was just beginning to emerge as a commercially available service. But it lacked standardized systems for formatting, storing, locating, and retrieving information. So we have the World Wide Web in 1989. Now we've had computers, they've been around since World War II, but they could not talk to each other. They were not connected. So the first time computers were joined was in 1969, which was called ARPANET. It was brought online in 1969 under a contract led by the renamed Advanced Research Projects Agency, which initially connected 4 major computers at universities in the southwestern U.S. The contract was carried out by BBN of Cambridge, Massachusetts, under Bob Kahn, and went online in December 1969. I find it interesting that Cambridge, Massachusetts is listed, and we have Cambridge Analytica later. The early internet was used by computer experts, engineers, scientists, and librarians. There was nothing friendly about it. There were no home or office personal computers in those days, and anyone who used it, whether a computer professional or an engineer or scientist or librarian, had to learn to use a very complex system. Fortran. What the network lacked was a standard systems for handling information, and this is what Tim Berners-Lee did. This is more about the internet than the internet itself. It's how information works across the internet. Here's a quote from the article. Like many people, I was completely unaware at the time of these historic developments. The web first came to my attention in early 1993 when Mark Andreessen and Eric Leina released their graphical browser called Mosaic. It is hard to evoke the stunning impact Mosaic had on the community of internauts who until that time were accustomed to text-based tools and keyboard navigation for retrieving content. The addition of imagery and magazine-like layout transformed the internet into a gigantic publishing vehicle, an information creation engine.
Interesting, publishing.
And what anybody can publish now. Mm-hmm. Their thoughts, their opinions, good things, bad things, it's all out there. So this is what's happening from 1989 into the early 90s. And we're going through our increase of knowledge at the same time they're turning the internet into a system of gigantic information creation machine. Continue with the quote. It was as if a new guild based on new technology had been created in the Middle Ages. the tsunami that flowed into the internet via the World Wide Web also created the need for tools to find specific content in an ocean of full of information. So the creations that Tim Berners-Lee created, now he was working at CERN as a scientist engineer, and he was in a place where they were losing the ability to keep track of their information. So that actually prompted him to come up with these creations. So he created this information engine on the internet where it could be disseminated and accessed in the way we know today.
URL.
Yes.
Uniform Resource Locator.
If you consider the internet as like a worldwide net of computers that are linked, they describe the web as being like an application running on top of the internet. And it's using that application by which we share web pages and information. He created one language for every computer system. And I find that interesting with, I just lost the word. When the people were creating the one language and God,
Babel.
thank you. So there's the one language there, and that was taken away, and now we have one language on the internet.
And we erected a tower.
He also developed what was HTML, HTTP, URL, and the World Wide Web. So in 1969, the invention of the internet, which is called ARPANET, was mainly used by the military defense systems to link their computers, and that spread pretty quickly. In 1989, Tim invents the World Wide Web. He wrote a paper entitled Information, a Proposal. And it was because of his job, and they were losing information because they were scientists, and people would write they would write about their projects, they would have data information. And when they left their CERN, they were noticing they were not able to find the information. They didn't know where it was located. And even with new projects, they couldn't find the old projects to combine with the new. And so he brought this, he wrote this paper, Information Management, a Proposal, and submitted it to his boss. This happened on March 12, 1989. In 1990, he creates the first browser, calling it the World Wide Web. First browser. In 1991, he released the browser, first time, to research institutes and then to the general public. So what's invented in 1989 is developed in 1990 and is released in 1991. We can see this history in three different ways: the fall of the Soviet Union, the increase of knowledge for us, and as the invention and development of the World Wide Web. What I'd like to mark next is 1996. Oops. And that's Moonlight Maze. A New York Times article wrote in 2016 about the hacking of the DNC in 2016. The United States had 2 decades of warning that Russia's intelligence agencies were trying to break into America's most sensitive computer networks, but the Russians have always managed to stay ahead. That sentence takes you to 1996, where it says 2 decades of warning. So from 2016 to go back 2 decades, it's 1996, which connects to Moonlight Maze. Their first major attack was detected on October 7th, 1996, when a computer operator at the Colorado School of Mines discovered some nighttime computer activity he could not explain. The school had a major contract with the Navy, and the operator warned his contacts there. Investigators gave it a name, Moonlight Maze, and spent 2 years, often working day and night, tracing how it hopped from the Navy to the Department of Energy to the Air Force and NASA. In the end, they concluded that the total number of files stolen, if printed and stacked, would be taller than the Washington Monument. Whole weapons designs were flowing out the door, and it was the first taste of what was to come, an escalating campaign of cyber attacks around the world. So was this cyber attack to take down infrastructure? No, it was for information. All they wanted was designs about weapons. Our next waymark on the line of information is September 11th, 2001. We're going to take a look at the Patriot Act, what it was for, and what was done under the Patriot Act. This act was passed 45 days after 9/11 in the name of national security. I'm going to read a quote from George Bush on October 26, 2001, as he signed the Patriot Act into law. Surveillance of communications is another essential tool to pursue and stop terrorists. The existing law was written in the era of rotary telephones. This new law that I sign today will allow surveillance of all communications by terrorists, including emails, the internet, and cell phones. Keep in the back of your mind the sentence that starts, the existing law was written in an era, and we're going to talk about that later. Senator Russ Feingold, the day before Bush signed the act into law, said, "The administration's proposed bill contains vast new powers for law enforcement, some seemingly drafted in haste, and others that came from the FBI wish list that Congress had rejected in the past." So he's noting here that there are things that the FBI had wanted for some period of time, but were not able to get it through Congress. But after 9/11, it gave them the opportunity, because of the fear that the attacks had generated, and enabled them to get their wish list through. So, October 26, 2001, the Patriot Act is signed into law. George Bush said this act was for surveillance of communication, for the accessing of personal information. But worth noting is that the information to be collected is online, on the internet. And that includes your private emails, websites that you visit, etc. There was an interesting article written by Nancy Chang, a senior litigation attorney for the Center of Constitutional Rights. The Patriot Act launched a three-pronged assault on privacy. First, it granted the executive branch unprecedented and largely unchecked surveillance powers, including the ability to track email and internet usage. Second, the Act permits law enforcement agencies to circumvent the Fourth Amendment's requirement of probable cause. So under the Constitution, they need a reason to access your personal information. That no longer exists at the time of this writing. Third, the Act follows for the sharing of that information between criminal and intelligence operations, thereby opening the door to a resurgence of domestic spying under the CIA. The Patriot Act is used against terrorism, but their definition of a terrorist is an enemy of the state, and that's a very broad definition. In fact, it's so vague and expansive, it can pretty much include organizations like Greenpeace, government protesters, anti-abortionists, environmental activists. Anyone that is seen as a danger to the state can be labeled as a domestic terrorist.
Wow, when you think about, no, never mind, I'll leave my comment quiet. Who's the main one here against the state?
But what they have used the Patriot Act to do 99.99% of the time has not been for terrorism. In fact, in an internal audit around 2014, they acknowledged that the Patriot Act had not thwarted to help a single terrorist attack within the United States. It had, though, been useful on the war on drugs, so it was not used for what they originally described it and signed it into purpose for. In other changes, Section 215 removed a FISA provision that limited the types of records that the government, with a FISA court order, could require certain businesses to produce, replacing it with a general authority to demand any tangible things of any third party, including books, records, papers, documents, and other items. This section also imposed a gag order that generally prohibited third parties from disclosing the fact that the FBI had sought or obtained such things. So basically this means any business or organization, your accountant, your financial advisor, your bank accounts, your credit card accounts, your telephone, can be presented with an NSL letter, basically a subpoena, and they are required to provide every bit of information that they have on you without providing any proof that those items are actually needed for an investigation. The receipt of such a letter from the NSA is to remain a secret. You're not to talk about it or share with anyone that you received that letter. And if you notify the person that you had provided the information, you could be fined and jailed. What they did to be able to circumvent the requirement of a court order that's found in the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, because these things are not to be done without a court order and showing probable cause and a reason as to why they need your information. So they created a secret intelligence court where they could technically get a court order. So going back to look at this court that was created, it's called the FISA Court. It's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It's a bill that they passed. It passed in 1978, but FISA was actually established in 1979 as an operational. It's actually known as FISC, and it came from FISA. So FISA is the act, and FISC is the court. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, 78-79. And that came as a result of the Watergate investigation when they found out people were being spied on. From 1979 to the date 2017, the court has approved 40,668 government applications. So 40,668 times the government said yes to requests for information gathering. This is a 38-year history, and how many times did the FISA court say no to the government? In 38 years, only 85 times. So there is a secret court that on average passes 1,042 requests a year and rejects an application approximately once every 2 years. One of the reasons is that it is set up this way is that it allows no one else to come before the court, no lawyers with adversarial viewpoints. Only the Department of Justice, only the people wanting the information are even allowed to present the case. No one else is allowed to access behind what is happening behind those closed doors, which means that if you have no defense. It's only between the government and the NSA or the CIA, whoever is seeking that information. So FISA was established and authorized under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 to oversee requests for surveillance warrants against foreign spies inside the United States by federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Such requests are made most often by the National Security Agency, which is NSA, and Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. Congress created FISA and its court as a result of the recommendations by the U.S. Senate Church Committee as a result of Watergate. The FISA court is a tribunal established in 1978 that decides whether to approve wiretaps, data collection, and government requests to monitor suspected terrorists and spies. It's near the White House. I think it's moved. It's not on Constitution Avenue anymore. Officials won't say exactly where the FISA courtroom is located in the bunker-like complex. It's so secretive. The room is tightly sealed to prevent eavesdropping. So how does the FISA court work? There's 11 district judges. They serve on a rotating basis, usually one time a week. And all the judges have a maximum term of 7 years. Only one person has the power to appoint the judges, and that's Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts. So it started in 1978 with the court's namesake, the FISA Intelligence Surveillance Act. And that act was enacted to authorize the electronic surveillance to obtain foreign intelligence information. Of course, back then also they had in mind still the Cold War, and foreign spying was the big deal, the big concern at the time. There was also the Watergate scandal, where it was discovered that the government had been spying on private citizens, especially Reverend Martin Luther King. The controversy over FISA blew up in 2013 when Edward Snowden revealed a secret court order approving the mass collection of metadata from telecom giant Verizon and internet companies such as Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo. That led to heated debate and the limits of privacy and due process. The FISA court does hear challenges, though. In 2013, Yahoo scored a win when FISA ruled that the government must publish court papers from 2008 detailing Yahoo's objections to releasing users' data without a warrant. But there are other reasons FISA court has come under fire. Because it's closed off from the public, and it only hears the government side, so some say the court basically just rubber stamps any request from the government. There's no oversight. It's a closed system. The Patriot Act, Section 216, permitted the use of pen and trap devices and pen registers which record the source and destination, respectively, of calls made to and from a particular telephone to monitor electronic communications, understood to include email and web browsing. Court orders for such surveillance do not require probable cause, but only a certification by the government that the evidence sought was likely to be relevant to a criminal investigation. Finally, to allay the concerns of legislators who had questioned the constitutionality of some provisions, Section 224, titled Sunset, stipulated that 16 sections and 2 subsections of the Act would cease to have effect on December 31st, 2005. And there's another section, 213. The government can search your private residence without notifying you before or after the search. You will never know that you were visited. Originally, it was confusing. I tried to read some of the Patriot Act myself, and the way they write it and the way they amend things is mind-boggling to try and understand this whole thing. And it's much clearer to understand now because of what we know, because of the past, and what Snowden has brought out. But we know that the government decided through the secret court to secret approval of the FISA court that they would interpret the Patriot Act to say that for national security, we could gather information for people relevant to the investigation, but that they would gather it nationwide. So they began to take in phone call records, internet usage, email of every United States citizen, and was gathered into a massive central database. Then their thought is that they're going to go through and siphon through the information and get what they're looking for. So they really basically wanted to create a huge haystack and look for some needles. Congressman John Sensenbrenner is the principal author of the Patriot Act. He has said, quote, "I can say that without qualification, Congress never did intend to allow for bulk collections when it passed Section 215, and no fair reading of the text would allow this program." So the people who wrote the Patriot Act never expected the government to do what it did. Now, one thing worth noting is that the Patriot Act of 2001 originally began as not permanent. It had provisions in it that would, what they call sunset, would expire. And I'm not going to go through all of the dates here, but you can see in your notes that there were repeated revisions of permanent sunsets were changed. Parts of the Patriot Act were changed from temporary to permanent. They had different dates of renewing it, different sunset dates. They were all the way up through 2015. The provisions were renewed and signed into law by President Obama. So then we go from the Patriot Act, the Patriot Act to the USA Freedom Act. On June 2nd, 2015, Obama signed the Senate-approved USA Freedom Act into law. It replaced the U.S. Patriot Act and curtailed the government's authority to collect data. This revision was largely in response to Edward Snowden's exposure in 2013 of the government's bulk collection of phone and internet records. So the USA Freedom Act stipulated that the government can access such data only after submitting public requests to the FISA court. They have the Freedom Act. don't know if, I've never heard of this till Sister Tess explained it, and I looked into further of it. It's an interesting operation by the government. It's called Operation PRISM, and you might want to do some of your own research. But George Bush began this operation in 2007, and it's a backdoor operation, mainly being, and this is what other countries use, like Russia and China and other authoritarian governments, where the government actually has a backdoor into the servers and can get internet information live as it's happening, not just information that shows where you have been in the past, but actually what you're doing in the present moment. So in 2007, on 9/11/2007, Microsoft, these platforms were affected. Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Paltalk, YouTube, Skype, AOL, and Apple. And this program allowed extensive and in-depth surveillance on live communications and stored information. So everything down to your Facebook messages can now be accessed through a back door. From 2007, these companies claim to not know this backdoor government operation even existed. And Microsoft was the first company to be accessed on September 11th, 2007. They can access your search history, stored data, content of emails, chat information, videos, photos, file transfers, social networking, all without probable cause and all without a warrant. Companies are legally obliged to comply with such requests for users' communications under the U.S. law, but the PRISM program allows the intelligence services direct access to company servers. It was reported in the Washington Post that NSA is tapping into the services of 9 leading internet firms, extracting audio and video chats, photographs, emails, documents, connection logs, and disclosure of the PRISM program occurred when a top secret court order compelling telecom provider Verizon to turn over the records of millions of customers. And that secret order was leaked to the Guardian newspaper. For the sake of national security, it is clear that the USA Patriot Act has violated the constitutional rights of citizens under the Fourth Amendment regarding the search and seizure of your private information. That the Patriot Act of 2001 relates directly to information in this internet age. So all that has occurred from 2001 and 2014 was made possible by how the powers that be in the U.S. government and the intelligence agencies were able to interpret the Patriot Act. There was a quote by Sandra Day O'Connor when she was visiting Ground Zero at the World Trade Center where it once stood. She said, certainly, she was there shortly after the attack on September 11th. And quote, "We are likely to experience more restrictions on personal freedoms than has ever been the case in this country's history." The stones are crying out. The next date to mark on our information line is 2004.
Over past 9/11.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot. Thank you. Thank you. Lisa, it's getting really hot in here.
Is it too warm in there?
No, it's just right.
Just open the door a little and let's just crack the air.
Don't open it for her that way. Oh, that, yeah, there you go.
Okay. Now, this is a really dramatic date as far as the events that happened. It involved President Bush, the Attorney General, CIA, FBI, NSA about a secret program that George Bush had authorized a secret national security directive in 2001. This directive was for unwarranted mass surveillance of Americans and was referred to as the program. And only a handful of people even knew that the program even existed. And part of this program, as a token of their sincerity or their concern over Fourth Amendment violations, was that it had to be reauthorized every 45 days. This is not about the Patriot Act, which was signed publicly on October 26, 2001. So now Bush has come up with this new program right after 9/11, but before October 26, when the Patriot Act came out. And it's a secret program. Okay, I'm going to share some this article from MSNBC about there was a hospital, of an event that happened at the hospital with Attorney General Ashcroft. So it talks about, I'm going to paraphrase, I'm not going to hit every paragraph here. It says, no one knows, oh, wait a minute, I go up above. So Comey was interviewed about this event, and they said that no one knows that better than Comey, who nearly resigned after discovering that Bush's own surveillance program had operated outside the law. Comey stayed after Bush agreed to fix the program. His 2004 clash over the Stellar Wind surveillance program with Vice President Dick Cheney famously came to a head in Attorney General John Ashcroft's hospital room and then in the Oval Office. So in 2003, Comey was appointed as Assistant Deputy Attorney General. And so that was setting the stage for what was going to happen in 2004. So he was appointed in 2003. Under his supervision, the Justice Department began reevaluating a top secret surveillance and wiretapping program codenamed Stellar Wind, which was operated by NSA and overseen by Vice President Cheney. The program, whose existence was known to only a handful of administration officials, required a regular renewal with the Attorney General's signature. A week before the March 11, 2004 deadline for the program's renewal, Ashcroft, Comey, and other department lawyers concluded that the domestic surveillance program was illegal. The next 7 days unfolded like a blockbuster movie, complete with speeding cars through the Capitol, blocked phone calls, an alien protagonist, and a determined man in pursuit of justice. Ashcroft had fallen ill, and he was rushed to the hospital. Comey became the acting Attorney General. On Tuesday, March 9th, Comey communicated his decision regarding the surveillance program to the White House and the relevant parties. The news should not have come as a surprise to Cheney, the NSA Director Michael Hayden, the White House counsel Alberto Gonzales, or Andrew Card, the President's Chief of Staff. They all had known for months what was brewing in the Justice Department, a potential mass exodus of top officials if Bush continued to authorize the program outside the law. With Comey refusing to reauthorize the program, Gonzales and Card were dispatched to extract a signature from a barely coherent Ashcroft. Alerted by Ashcroft's chief of staff, Comey raced to the hospital, emergency lights flashing and all, and literally ran up the stairs in an effort to reach the sick Attorney General first. He called Mueller and other senior Justice Department lawyers, and the Secret Service was ordered to guard the door. Quote, I was concerned, given how ill I knew the Attorney General was, that there might be an effort to ask him to overrule me when he was in no condition to do that, Comey testified 3 years later. So Comey was successful in blocking Card and Gonzalez, but Cheney marched on. I lost my page. Okay, the next day, Bush signed a directive to keep the program going. Amazingly, he did it without the Attorney General signing it, which is highly unusual. Comey wrote a resignation letter, but he agreed to wait a few days to deliver it so that Ashcroft, when well enough, could quit alongside him. I kind of see this as the battle of Gabriel and the Prince of Persia, yes. And it's that spiritual battle going on in the heavens that's happening here, because things are, I mean, they are really amazing. And there's a very nice documentary on this topic. I'll push on the board later. Bush, however, was still in the dark, and according to an account of the episode in the Washington Post. So after a morning briefing in the Oval Office, Comey then had an opportunity to talk with the president. He informed the president that Mueller was going to resign. But Mueller didn't, and Comey never handed in his letter. Because 7 days later, Bush amended his renewal of the Stellar Wind surveillance program and asked the department to make changes so that it could continue within the law. So what we have here is, in 2004, is 2 men restraining the executive branch and a secret directive put in place before the Patriot Act. So we have a restraint. And it's Comey. Now, of course, we realize that Mueller and Comey are, we're not suggesting they're perfect men or good men, and that they haven't made mistakes, but it's worth noting the role that they played, because you can see on the line how this information age is developing. And right now, this is the government line of it, because the government gets in on this information collecting. But we have to keep in mind who else is getting into this information collecting later, and it goes on a individual, not government level, but outside the government, which is Cambridge Analytica. Okay. So next on our line is 2014, but first I want to go ahead and do a little more review of what has happened before. So we see a build-up, how the ARPANET came in 1969, leading up to 1989 for the invention of the World Wide Web, and in between there, because of what happened in Watergate back in the 1970s, the FISA Court and the FISA Act come into existence, which will then, and actually the Patriot Act is literally an amendment to the FISA Act. It does not stand alone. And the Freedom Act is also an amendment to the FISA Act, so they're all together. So now we have the World Wide Web, we have a browser, and it's released to the public. We have our first cyber attack and an introduction by the Russians. And, you know, we'll see them in 20 years. We have the Patriot Act, but before the Patriot Act, we actually have the secret operation, the program. And this is the restraint that Comey had with restraining Bush from dealing with the program that allowed unlimited warrantless surveillance. So in 2014, we should see something about the Patriot Act, something that relates to information. So we know that it marks our Sunday law. We know that it marks our Sunday law as priests. And the argument is whether or not there really is a Sunday law, or that there was a Sunday law in 2014, and it's because we're not able to see it. We had something in our mind that we expected to see, and it was not there. So the key to understanding what the Sunday law was in 2014 is understanding the relationship between the external and the internal. That whatever is happening internally is happening externally. And we can already see that on our reform lines, this relationship between external and internal. The internal of 2012, 13, and 14 is the key to understanding the external of 2014 as it relates to information and as it relates to a Sunday law, and it must follow our theme. So let's first consider the internal of 2014. Inside this movement that year, it had some peculiar characteristics. And those are the key. We had a message of that time come in 2012 that predicted what 2014 would be. First, in 2012, we had the rejection of leadership. Second, in 2013, we had the work of enemies, such as Path of the Just, Tree of Life. So what we see over this external history of 2012, 13, and 14 is that the Patriot Act is coming up for renewal. Obama ran on the promise that he would repeal the Patriot Act, that it would be discarded. He comes into office and he is forced into it on one level by his intelligence agencies, who say that this is necessary, and he also buys into their argument that the Patriot Act must remain. But he still wants to cut back on it to some extent. By coming up to this history in 2013, what we had is the work of the enemies. The reason we know so much about this information timeline history, especially what was done under the Patriot Act in this history, is thanks to one man, Edward Snowden, who copied files and then released all this information in June of 2013. He was working internally as a NSA contractor, and he was distressed at the level of surveillance that was being done on Americans without their knowledge. He saw what would happen to other NSA whistleblowers, and it was not good. He had seen how their lives had been destroyed by the government. So he decided to provide evidence of constitutional violations of privacy acts. He contacted a few reputable journalists and then copied and released 50,000 documents of information of what the government was doing in secret under not just the Patriot Act, but much more. So here we have the work of enemies. What Snowden did in 2013 was the greatest attack against the Patriot Act since its release in 2001. This created a huge change in how companies now share and store your information. Before 2013, information was not encrypted. After 2013, it is encrypted. It also led to a bunch of civil liberty lawsuits against the government. So now we have tech companies are scrambling because now they're all worried about what information is being shown. They have to work on their applications to getting encryption. And we can see now that the companies really didn't care about us in the beginning. It was only after they got caught that they did the encryption. Gillian York, the Director of International Freedom of Expression for the digital rights group, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, quote, "If I could take myself back to 2013, without Snowden, I don't think that Signal would have gotten the funding. I don't think Facebook would have Alex Stamos. These little things led to big things. It's not like these companies were caring about the privacy. They were pushed to care about privacy. And this brought encryption to all those sites where the government had previously been accessing." It's been said that by a head of security in England that Snowden has taken so much information, but he has only released about 1%. And now the government has to live in fear of the future information that he could release at any time. And so now they not only have to go through and reform their practices of those that can be seen, they now have to anticipate further trouble and changes, and that's what made him upset. Here's a quote from U.S. District Judge Richard Leon in December of 2013. "The almost Orwellian technology that enabled the government to store and analyze the phone metadata of almost every telephone user in the United States is unlike anything that could have been conceived in 1979 when the Supreme Court case Smith versus Maryland first allowed the government to collect such data." And he said also, "The almost Orwellian program almost certainly violates the Fourth Amendment." So we have 1979, Smith versus Maryland. Okay, so in 1979, the Supreme Court case Smith versus Maryland, his argument was that the U.S. government had, the government's access to his phone records was unconstitutional. And what is so pivotal about this case, and that even though he lost the case, it pretty much marked the beginning of government collecting similar data of hundreds of millions of people, and now they have a precedent ruling that allows it. So you can trace that collection data back to 1979. So even before World Wide Web and all the other inventions that we have for the information age, this happening in 1979 was based on rotary telephones. And so it set the precedent that they could gather that information and not realizing what information was going to be able to be gathered, the amount of information that could be gathered when it was only a rotary telephone in the beginning. Okay. So 2015, Freedom Act, the USA Freedom Act. So parts of the Patriot Act expired on June 1st. With the passing of the Freedom Act on June 2nd, the expired parts were renewed through December 15, 2019. In fact, in November 2019, Congress approved another 3-month extension of the expiration date of the Patriot Act. The USA Freedom Act did not make the Patriot Act cease to exist. Because they're all, what happened in the Patriot Act is those provisions, those sections of the Patriot Act that were temporary actually became permanent. And of course, all of this is still amendments to the FISA Act from 1978. So we're under the Freedom Act, that's true, but the Patriot Act, the 14 out of the 16 provisions were made permanent in 2005. And the Patriot Act author was instrumental in passing the Freedom Act. Edward Snowden remarked that the Freedom Act was a first step and an important step, and heralded the phone program's demise as a significant victory in pushing back on government claims to need enhanced powers. So the original, again, Jim Sensenbrenner, the author of the Patriot Act, said a large interest of government, however benevolent they claim to be, is not immune from the simple truth that centralized power threatens liberty.
Mm-hmm.
Our government's legitimacy rests on its accountability to the people, and Americans are increasingly leery that Washington is invading the privacy acts guaranteed to us by the Fourth Amendment. Basically, he's saying it's unconstitutional. And this is what he's saying and arguing in 2014. And this war is going down in 2014 between two opposing factions. The rejection of leadership by Obama in 2012 and the work of enemies by Snowden in 2013. So the USA Freedom Act actually basically gave a compromise to the groups that were fighting among themselves, that they would no longer allow bulk data collecting. The Patriot Act, also amended by the USA Freedom Act, also reauthorizes two portions of the Patriot Act, the lone wolf target and the roving wiretaps. So we have learned prophetically that Obama is not the bad guy in the history of 2013 to 2015. He did manage to repeal some aspects of the Patriot Act. What he did not do is extend our line of information. He is not the one we are to look to for a Sunday law, as a Sunday law cannot come through a Democrat president. It does not come through Obama in this history, and that is the fight in 2014. So what they were trying to do is not bring in the Sunday law. This was a desperate attempt to maintain what they had brought in at 9/11. And the largest defender of the Patriot Act, and who was determined to have it continued in 2014 in its current state, was Mitch McConnell. They wanted to keep what they had. They didn't want to lose any power. So a Democrat president, a majority in the Senate, and Edward Snowden, the work of enemies, makes a Sunday law impossible. So to clarify, 14 portions of the Patriot Act are still in effect, and we are still subject to it, and subject to the USA Freedom Act. But the Freedom Act was a compromise between those who were for and against the Patriot Act. It restricted some aspects of the Patriot Act, and it allowed some of much of the same behavior, but many feel like it really never changed, that it's actually just another version of the Patriot Act. In May 7, 2015, a federal appeals court ruled that the NSA program of collecting the bulk phone information is illegal. And then a wave of cases began to rise up against the government. And a little bit more about Moonlight Maze is that the future began with Moonlight Maze, and it was the beginning of a new era, and it never has stopped. as we know. So if we mark to 2 years for Russia hacking between 1996 and 2014, it hasn't stopped. So in 2014, we're speaking of hacking that began in 1996, resurfaced in 2014. There was a cyber attack over a 24-hour period of time where unclassified State Department computers were being hacked, and they literally worked for 24 hours in shifts between these Russian aggressors, and it was like a tennis match. One would do one thing, and another one would go back to it, and they were battling within the internet system. And this was only for an unclassified State Department files, and they really believe that this was just a practice run for the communists, for the Russians. So the NSA group, they managed to win the battle. They were attacking from the inside, and they were the same ones that ended up hacking in 2016, and they were all Russians. They just wanted to gauge our response to this. So to understand 2014, we'll go back to 1989, where in 1989, Nigel Oakes establishes the Behavioral Dynamics Working Group. This group was formed to study the dynamics of behavior. I think we've run out of time. I'm gonna continue this part in the next section. We'll stop at that point there. So we'll close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this Sabbath day. We thank you for your blessings. We thank you for the opportunity to study and to understand what has been happening within our own government and how information has been used to a degree that we never could comprehend, but you are showing us through the lines. We ask you for wisdom and understanding and clarity of mind to understand what it means to be in an information war. We thank you for your blessings, and we ask your blessing upon the meal that we'll be having. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.